The crying had found its form by the third month. Not immediately. In the beginning it had been the raw, ungoverned kind, the kind that arrives before the person has had time to build any infrastructure around it. The first week she had stood at the bus stop and the crying had simply happened without shape or schedule, the way something happens when the body decides it has been holding something too long and releases it without asking permission. By the third week the shape had begun to emerge. Not a decision, the specific, organic form that a repeated experience finds when it is repeated often enough. 7:15 Arrival. The crying during the wait. The composure arriving, as though the bus were a deadline, in the 2 minutes before the 7:23 pulled in. The boarding. The face that went to work. By the third month it was a routine. She had not decided to make it a routine. The bus stop had simply become the place where she was allowed to be what she was between leaving him with Mrs. Bello and arriving at the hospital where she was required to be something else. Ada, 38 years old. A nurse for 14 years. The mother of an 11-year-old boy named Emeka who had been in treatment for a blood condition for 11 months and who had named the forestand at the treatment clinic Gerald and who had said, when she asked if he would like her to request that the wheel on Gerald be fixed, "Do not replace it." Gerald would not be Gerald with a fixed wheel. She was a person who had not cried at a bus stop before this year. She was now a person who did. The man from the shop across the street had noticed her in the second week. Not immediately. In the first week he had registered her the way he registered all the regulars at the bus stop, which was the specific, peripheral registration of someone whose window faces the street and whose work requires his attention to be primarily on the counter and the stock and the customer in front of him and only secondarily on what is happening outside. The bus stop regulars were part of the specific, ambient geography of the street the way the lamppost and the groundnut cellar and the crack in the pavement at the corner were part of it, present, noted, not examined. In the second week he had looked up from the counter at 7:21 and seen her still at the bus stop, 2 minutes before the bus, when the bus stop was always at its fullest, and he had noticed that she was crying. Not noticeably, the specific, contained quality of someone who is crying without wanting to be seen crying, the face that is doing its best to hold what the body is producing. He had looked at her for a moment. He had looked back at the counter. The next morning he had looked up at 7:21 and she had been there and she had been crying again in the same specific, contained way and he had thought, this is not one bad day. He had thought, this is something ongoing. He had filed this with the care he filed everything, not intrusively, not as information he intended to act on, simply as information. He was a person who paid attention to the people on his street. This was partly the professional quality of a shopkeeper who understood that knowing his regulars was part of the work, and partly something more personal, the specific quality of someone who had sat beside his wife for 4 years while she was ill and had learned, in those years, that the practice of paying attention to another person was not surveillance. It was the specific, ongoing act of saying, "You are here, I see that you are here, your presence on the street registers with me." He had not said this to the woman at the bus stop. He had watched for 11 months. On the morning of the 11th month, he had crossed the street. His name was Chikwudi Chudi, and he had been on this street for 8 years. The shop had been the specific, accumulated project of 20 years of working for someone else in a shop that was not his and understanding, gradually and then finally, every element of what was required to run one correctly. He had found the space, had signed the lease, had built the stock from the specific, considered position of someone who knew not just what sold but why it sold and what the person who needed it was actually looking for when they came through the door. He had built his customer knowledge the way he built everything, slowly, from genuine attention rather than calculation. His wife Ngozi had died 6 years ago. The long kind 4 years of a narrowing that had its own specific elongated quality, a life reducing by increments until the increments themselves became the whole of it. He had sat beside her through all 4 years. He had learned, in those years, what it was to be present with someone who was carrying something he could not take from them. He had learned that presence was what was available when solutions were not. He had learned that asking the right question at the right moment, not the performed question, the real one, the one that said I see what you are in rather than I see what would make me feel useful, was sometimes the only thing that could be offered and was not nothing. He had not been with anyone since she died. Not from grief in the dramatic sense, from the specific, considered quality of someone who had been through something real and was not willing to accept something lesser. He was 42 and he was alone in the specific, functional way of someone who has made an accommodation with aloneness that is not comfortable exactly but is honest, that does not misrepresent itself. He had watched the woman at the bus stop for 11 months. He had asked on a Tuesday. He had said, "I have been watching you cry at this bus stop every morning for 11 months. He had said it simply, without preamble or softening, because he had learned that saying difficult things plainly was a form of respect, that softening the thing was sometimes a way of protecting yourself from the discomfort of saying it rather than protecting the other person from the discomfort of hearing it. He had said, "I do not know you and you do not have to tell me anything, but I am asking, are you all right? Is there something I can do?" She had said, "No." She had said, "There is nothing you can do." She had said, "But thank you for asking." She had gotten on the bus. He had walked back across the street. He had gone behind the counter. He had not done anything. He had asked a question and received an honest answer, and the day had continued in the way that days continue when the thing that happened in them was small but real. But something had shifted, in him, in the quality of the space between the shop and the bus stop, and the shift was going to produce something. The thing she was carrying had arrived 11 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon. Not as a sudden thing, the diagnosis had its own specific, gradual arrival the way certain diagnoses arrive. A symptom that had been present for a while, a concern that had been noted, an appointment made without urgency that became urgent by the time it happened. She had taken Emeka to the clinic because he had been tired in the specific, persistent way of a child who is tired beyond what tiredness should be, whose tiredness was qualitatively different from the tiredness of a child who has played too hard or stayed up too late. She had noted this with the specific professional attention of a nurse who has spent 14 years learning to read the difference between the body doing what bodies do and the body signaling something. Dr. Okafor had said the name of the condition. She had received it with the specific professional composure of a nurse who knows what names mean, who does not need the condition translated, who does not need the initial softening of a doctor managing a layperson's panic. She had received it and she had said, "What is the treatment protocol?" Dr. Okafor had told her. She had driven home. She had made dinner. Emeka had said, "You are quiet." She had said, "I am thinking." He had said, "About what?" She had said, "Your treatment." She had said it directly because she was not a person who managed Emeka with softening. She had been raising him alone since he was 4, and she had learned, in those 7 years, that children raised with honesty become more capable of receiving difficult things honestly than children raised with protection. She had told him about the diagnosis in the specific, accurate language of a nurse who was also his mother, giving him the information, not the performance of the information. He had said, "How long?" She had said, "It depends on how the treatment goes." She had said, "The doctor is good." She had said, "We are going to do this." He had said, "Will there be a stand?" She had said, "What?" He had said, "And 4 stand." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "What color?" She had said, "I do not know." He had said, "I hope it is a good one." She had called Adana that night. She had told her sister. Adana had said, "I am coming." She had said, "Not yet." She had said, "Let me understand the full picture first." Adana had said, "Ada." She had said, "Give me a month. Let me have 1 month first." She had asked Mrs. Bello if she could watch Emeka in the mornings. Mrs. Bello had looked at her in the specific reading way Mrs. Bello had, the specific quality of 65 years of watching people and knowing what the asking behind the asking was. She had said, "Bring him." She had said, "Every morning." She had said, "I will have the television on." The first morning she had left him and walked to the bus stop, she had felt the specific quality of a person arriving at the threshold of something that was going to require everything they had and who was standing at the threshold understanding this. The bus stop had been cold. The 7:23 had been 3 minutes late. She had cried for 11 minutes. She had gotten on the bus. She had arrived at the hospital and she had been a nurse. The morning after he asked, she was at the bus stop at 7:15. She was not crying yet. The crying usually started around 7:18, the specific, punctual quality of a routine that had established its own internal clock. She was standing at the stop with her bag and her coat and the specific, forward-tilting quality of someone who is already mentally at the next place even though they are still at this one. He came out of the shop at 7:18. He crossed the street. He was carrying a paper cup of tea, the specific, ordinary quality of a cup of tea from a small shop's electric kettle, Not a barista's production, simply tea made and brought. He said, I did not ask yesterday to make you feel observed. He said, I asked because I have a window that faces this stop and you are here every morning and I am not able to not notice. He said, I brought you tea. He said, you do not have to talk to me. She looked at him. She took the tea. She said, my son's name is Emeka. She said, he is 11 years old. She said, he has a blood condition and he has been in treatment for 11 months. She said, I leave him every morning with my neighbor and I take the bus to the hospital where I work and I cry at this bus stop because this is the only place available where I am allowed to. He said nothing for a moment. He said, what is his name again? She said, Emeka. He said, how is he? She said, he is 11 years old and he has named the 4 stand at the clinic Gerald. She said, the wheel on Gerald is bent and he will not let me ask them to replace it because he says Gerald would not be Gerald with a fixed wheel. She said, she stopped. She said, he is extraordinary. She said, he is the most extraordinary person I know and he is 11 years old and I am his mother and there is almost nothing I can do about the fact that he is sick. He said, almost. She said, what? He said, you said almost nothing. Not nothing. Almost nothing. She looked at him. She had said almost nothing. She had not noticed she had said almost rather than nothing. He had noticed. The bus came. She got on it. She was holding the paper cup when she boarded. She drank the tea on the bus to the hospital and it was ordinary tea, the specific functional quality of tea that has been made with an electric kettle and a standard bag and no particular skill. And it was the best thing she had tasted in 11 months because someone had brought it to her at a bus stop and said, you do not have to talk to me. She told Mrs. Bello that evening when she came to collect Emeka. She said, the man from the shop across the street brought me tea this morning. Mrs. Bello said, Chudy. She said, you know him? She said, I have been on this street for 20 years. She said, he has been here for 8. She said, he is a good man, the specific, efficient quality of someone delivering a verdict they have arrived at through long observation and do not feel the need to elaborate. Emeka had appeared in the doorway. He said, what man from what shop? She said, the provision shop across from the bus stop. Emeka said, the one with the blue awning? She said, yes. He said, I can see it from your window. He said this to Mrs. Bello, who nodded in the specific, unsurprised way of someone who already knew that Emeka could see most things from most windows if he chose to look. Ada said, come, let us go home. Emeka came. At the door he stopped and looked at his mother. He said, does he make good tea? She said, it is ordinary tea. He said, you said it was the best thing you had tasted in 11 months. She said, how do you know what I said? He said, Mrs. Bello told me. She looked at Mrs. Bello. Mrs. Bello was looking at the television. The 12 minutes became the thing she organized her morning around. Not immediately. In the first week after the tea she had not changed her routine. She had arrived at 7:15 and cried and he had crossed at 7:18 with the cup and they had talked for the 8 minutes before the bus came and she had gotten on the bus. The routine had simply acquired an additional element. The crossing, the cup, the 8 minutes. But by the second week she had noticed herself leaving the flat 4 minutes earlier than she needed to. She had told herself this was because the street was quieter at 7:11 than at 7:15 and the quiet was useful. She had told herself this until the third week when she had stopped telling herself anything about it and had simply accepted that she was leaving 4 minutes earlier because 4 more minutes at the bus stop with the man from the shop was worth the adjustment. He was always there when she arrived. Not because he had adjusted his schedule for her. The shop opened at 7 and he was there at 7 and had been there at 7 for 8 years. But the crossing had become its own routine within the larger routine. She arrived, she stood at the stop, he appeared at the window, he crossed. The specific, wordless choreography of two people who have developed a shared rhythm without discussing it. He brought different things. Tea first, always tea, the electric kettle version, functional and warm. But alongside the tea, sometimes a banana, placed on the wall beside her without ceremony. Sometimes a small packet of biscuits. Once a single mandarin orange, which she had eaten in 4 sections on the bus and which had been, in the specific way of unexpected things, the best orange she had tasted in a long time. She had said, on the morning of the mandarin, why an orange? He had said, You have been eating the biscuits without actually tasting them. He said, I thought you needed something that required attention. She had looked at him. She had said, you notice things. He had said, it is a small street. He said, I have a window. She had said, it is more than the window. He had not denied it. She told him about Emeka in increments. The 12 minutes was not long enough for the full thing. For the 11 months of it, the specific shape of what treatment for a blood condition looked like in the daily reality of a mother who was also a nurse and who therefore could not protect herself from knowing what she was looking at. She could not receive the information about her son's condition the way a layperson receives medical information, with the specific, useful insulation of not fully understanding what the numbers meant. She understood exactly what the numbers meant. She had been understanding exactly what numbers meant for 14 years, and the understanding that had made her a good nurse was the same understanding that made the mornings at the bus stop necessary. She told him about the treatment schedule, the specific days, the clinic, the drive there and back with Emeka in the passenger seat asking questions about the equipment. She told him about Emeka's questions. She said, he asked Dr. Okafor once what the cellular mechanism of the condition was. He said, what? She said, he is 11. She said, he had looked it up. She said, Dr. Okafor had spent 4 minutes explaining it and Emeka had said, so the problem is upstream of the symptom. Dr. Okafor had said, yes, essentially. Emeka had said, then why are we treating downstream? Dr. Okafor had said, because the upstream intervention is not yet available at the level of clinical application. Emeka had said, when will it be? Dr. Okafor had said, it is an active area of research. Emeka had said, I will look it up. Chudi had listened to this with the specific, attentive quality she was learning was simply how he listened, fully, without dividing his attention between what was being said and what he was going to say in response. He had said, what did he find? She had said, 3 papers published in the last 2 years. He made Dr. Okafor read them. He had said, what did Dr. Okafor say? She had said, he said one of them was promising and 2 were preliminary. He said, Emeka said, which one is promising? Dr. Okafor had shown him. Emeka had said, I am going to write to the researchers. She said, he is 11 years old. He said, did he write to them? She said, yes. He said, did they respond? She said, one of them did. A professor. She said, they have been corresponding by email for 3 months. Chudi had looked at her. He had said, your son is corresponding with a research professor about his own condition. She had said, yes. He had said, how are you this morning? She had said, I have been better. She had said, I have also been worse. He had said, that is an honest answer. She had said, I am a nurse. Honest answers are what I have. He had said, it is a good thing to have. She had learned, over the 12 minutes of many mornings, the specific geography of him. Not all at once and not in any particular order, the way you learn the geography of a place you visit regularly, the details accumulating in the peripheral way that details accumulate when you are not specifically seeking them. He had grown up on the island, had come to the mainland in his 20s for work, had stayed because the work required staying and then because the staying had become its own reason. He had worked for 17 years in a provision shop that belonged to a man named Alhaji Musa before opening his own. He had learned everything Alhaji Musa could teach him and some things Alhaji Musa did not know he was teaching him. The things you learn by watching a person manage their business over many years, the principles that are never stated because they are assumed, that become visible only when you have spent enough time in the presence of someone who operates by them. He had learned, know your regulars better than they know themselves. He had learned, the person who comes in every Tuesday for the same thing is telling you something. He had learned, the person who asks a question about a product is not always asking about the product. He had learned, credit is not charity. It is the specific acknowledgement that people's circumstances vary and the shop that understands this builds the loyalty the shop that does not understand it cannot buy. He had not told her about Ngozi for 6 weeks. Not because it was secret, because there was a specific moment for it and the moment had not arrived. He had known she was a widow, not from the wearing of it but from the specific, recognizable quality of someone who has been the only adult in a household for long enough that the aloneness has become structural, has become part of how they move and think and manage. He had recognized this quality because he had it himself. On the morning of the 6th week she had said, "Tell me about her." He had said, "Ngozi." She had said, "Yes." He had told her. He told it the way he told everything, directly, without the performed emotion of someone presenting a difficult experience. He said, "She was a teacher." He said, "Primary school." He said, "She taught the same class for 9 years, and every year at the end of the year she wept because she loved the children and they were moving to the next class and she would not be their teacher anymore." He said, "She wept every June." He said, "I asked her once, 'You know this is coming every year. Does it not become easier?' She had said, 'The knowing does not change the feeling.'" He had said, "She was right." He said, "I have thought about that often since." Ada had said, "What did she love besides the children?" He had said, "Groundnut soup." He said, "The wrong kind, the kind my mother said was not correct." He had said, "She had her own position on the correct kind of groundnut soup and she maintained it against considerable opposition." He had said, "She was not a person who abandoned her positions." Ada had said, "What was her position?" He had said, "That the tomatoes go in before the groundnut paste." He said, "My mother said the groundnut paste goes in before the tomatoes." He said, "Ngozi said my mother was wrong." He had said it with the specific warmth of someone recounting a conflict that was always also an expression of love. He had said, "She was probably right." He had said, "My mother's soup was good. His had been better." Ada had said, "You miss her." He had said, "Every day." He had said, "It becomes different." He had said, "It does not become less." He said, "It becomes a shape you can carry." Ada had said, "Yes." She had said it with the specific quality of someone who knows exactly what is being described. Not because they have lost a spouse, but because they have been learning over 11 months how grief becomes a shape you carry. How it finds its form. How the bus stop at 7:15 becomes the place where the shape has room. He had looked at her. The bus had come. She had gotten on. He had walked back across the street and he had thought about what she had said, yes, with the specific quality of someone who knows. He had thought about Ngozi saying, "The knowing does not change the feeling." He had thought, "No, it does not." The 7th month brought Emeka to the bus stop. Not by arrangement, by Emeka, who had been having a rest week and who had appeared at the door on a Wednesday morning with his coat on and his bag and the specific, settled expression of someone who has made a decision and is not entertaining discussion of it. He had said, "I am coming." She had said, "Emeka, I am going to work." He had said, "I know. I am coming to the bus stop first." He had said, "Mrs. Bello can watch me from the window." She had looked at him. He had said, "I want to meet him." She had said, "There is not time." He had said, "There is another bus in 20 minutes." They had crossed the street. The shop was open. Chudi was behind the counter. He had looked at Ada. He had looked at the boy beside her, 11 years old, rich dark brown skin. The specific, watchful quality of a child who had been looked at by medical professionals for long enough that he had decided to look back at the world with equal attention. Emeka had said, "I am Emeka." Chudi had said, "I am Chudi." Emeka had looked at him with the same quality he looked at everything, directly, without the performed shyness of a child meeting an adult he has been told about, simply present and paying attention. He had said, "You bring my mother tea." Chudi had said, "Yes." He had said, "She has a flask. She could make her own." He said it without accusation, as an observation. He said, "But she does not. She waits for yours." He said, "I think that means something." Ada had said, "Emeka." Emeka had said, "Do you have anything with chocolate?" Chudi had found something with chocolate. 2 things, in fact, one for Emeka and one he had placed on the counter without comment, which Emeka had picked up and looked at and placed in his pocket with the specific, unsentimental efficiency of a child who does not make a production of receiving something. They had stayed for 14 minutes. She had been late for her shift. It was the first morning in 11 months she had not cried at the bus stop. She had not noticed this until she was on the bus and she was not crying, and the not crying was different from the composure that arrived before the bus. It was earlier, it was fuller, it had the specific, solid quality of something that was not being held together by effort. She had thought, "That is new." She had thought, "That is because of the 14 minutes." She had looked out the bus window at the street passing and she had thought. Emeka said he thought it meant something. She had thought, he is 11 years old and he is right. She told Adana that Sunday. She called every Sunday. They spoke for the usual hour. She told Adana about the treatment update, which was cautiously positive. The numbers were moving in the direction Dr. Okafor wanted them to move, not quickly but correctly. She said, cautiously positive is good. She said, cautiously positive is what we have. She said, and you? How are you? She said, there is a man. Adana was quiet for a moment. She said, tell me. She told her. The shop. The window. The 11 months. The tea. The 12 minutes. The mandarin orange. Emeka appearing with his coat on and saying, I want to meet him. The 14 minutes. The first morning in 11 months she had not cried. Adana was quiet for a long time. Then Adana said, Ada. She said, you have been carrying this for 11 months at a bus stop on your own. She said, not on my own. She said, Mrs. Bello. She said, Dr. Okafor. She said, you. She said, you know what I mean. She said, yes. She said, and now there is someone. She said, it is 12 minutes every morning. It is tea. She said, Ada. She said, I know. Adana said, does he know about you? What you are carrying? She said, yes. She said, I have been telling him for 7 months in 12-minute increments. She said, he knows about Gerald. He knows about the research professor. He knows about the first morning I did not cry. She said, he was there. She said, what does he know about you? Not Emeka. You. She was quiet. She said, he knows I said almost nothing instead of nothing. He said, almost. He noticed. She said, he knows I eat biscuits without tasting them. He said I needed something that required attention. He gave me an orange. She said, he knows that Ngozi's groundnut soup was better than his mother's, and that she maintained her position on the tomatoes against considerable opposition. She said, he knows that grief becomes a shape you can carry. Adana was very quiet. Then she said, when are you going to tell him that you love him? She said, Adana. She said, Ada. She said, it is 12 minutes every morning. She said, it is tea at a bus stop. She said, Ada. She said, I have known you for 34 years. I know what your voice sounds like when you are talking about someone you love. She said nothing. She said, I am not telling you to do anything. She said, I am just noting what I hear. She said, good night, Adana. She said, good night. She said, Ada. She said, the 12 minutes are not the thing. She said, the 12 minutes are the shape the thing has found for now. She put the phone down. She sat in her flat in the specific, evening quiet of a flat that had one adult in it and one child asleep in the back room and all the sounds of the building around her. She thought about what Adana had said. The 12 minutes are not the thing. The 12 minutes are the shape the thing has found for now. She thought. Ngozi said the knowing does not change the feeling. She thought, yes. She thought, I know. The 12 minutes had a specific grammar. She had not named it this. The naming was something she did later, in the way you name things after you have understood them rather than before. But looking back, she could identify the specific, consistent structure of the 12 minutes the way you identify the structure of something after you have been inside it long enough for the pattern to become visible. It opened with the crossing. He would appear at the window. She could see him there before he crossed, the specific silhouette of someone who has registered a presence and is moving toward it, and then he would be across the street with whatever he had brought and the 12 minutes would begin. The first 2 minutes were usually the cup and the question. Not, how are you? He did not ask how are you except in the way that required an honest answer, which was different from the social version of the question. He would ask something specific. How did Emeka sleep? What did Dr. Okafor say on Thursday? Did the research professor write back? The specific question of someone who had been accumulating the details of her situation over weeks and months and was following the thread rather than beginning again each morning. The middle 6 minutes were where the telling happened. This was the part she had not expected, not the receiving of the cup or the fact of his presence, but the specific quality of what the 6 minutes produced in her. She had always been a private person, not sealed. She called Adana every Sunday. She had colleagues at the hospital she trusted. She had Mrs. Bello. But the specific, ongoing account of what she was carrying, told in 6-minute increments to a man she had not known 11 months ago, had produced something she had not had before. The experience of being followed, not watched, followed. The difference between those two things was the difference between being observed and being accompanied. He was not watching her situation. He was walking alongside it in the specific, constrained way that 12 minutes at a bus stop allowed. The last 4 minutes were different from the first 8. In the last 4 minutes, as the bus was approaching, as the composure was arriving in preparation for the boarding, the conversation shifted without either of them directing the shift. Away from Emeka and the treatment and the specific, ongoing weight of the year, toward something lighter. Not performed lightness, the specific, organic lightness of two people who have been in a difficult subject together and are finding, naturally, the small release that comes from stepping briefly out of it. He told her things about the street. She had not known how much there was to know about a street you have been standing on every morning for 11 months without being part of it. He knew the history of every business on the block. The groundnut seller who had been there for 22 years and whose daughter had taken over the scale but not the recipes and whose customers had noticed the difference and returned gradually as the daughter found her way. The tailor 2 doors down who worked from 4 in the morning until the light was gone and who had told Chudi once that he sewed from the inside out. He understood the inside of the garment before the outside, which was why the things he made held their shape. The woman who sold pepper from a cart every Tuesday and Thursday who had been selling from the same cart for 16 years and who had, 2 years ago, been offered a shop front and declined it because she had told him the cart was where she did her thinking and a shop would take the cart away. She had listened to these things and she had thought, this is what 11 months at a bus stop looks like from inside the street rather than from the edge of it. She had been at the edge of it, waiting, passing through, the stop a means to another place. He was of it. The street was not the means to somewhere else. The street was the place. She had said one morning, do you ever want to be somewhere else? He had said, I have been somewhere else. He had said, I worked for 17 years for Alhaji Musa. He had said, I was good at it and it was not mine. He had said, this is mine. He had said, when something is yours, the question of whether you want to be somewhere else becomes different. He had said, the question becomes, am I being what this place requires? He had said, that is a better question. She had said, I know that feeling. She had said, the hospital. She had said, 14 years and I still walk in and think, this is mine in the sense that matters. She had said, I do not own it. She had said, but the work is mine. She had said, what I give to the patients is mine to give and nobody can take it from me. He had said, yes. He had said, that is exactly it. The bus had come. She had thought, boarding, we have just said something important to each other without naming it as important. She had thought, that is how he does everything. She had learned about his mother in the 3rd month. Not the full account, in increments the way she had learned everything about him. His mother was 71 and lived in the East and called on Wednesdays and expected him to answer on the 1st or 2nd ring. A requirement he met without fail because it was easier to answer on the 1st or 2nd ring than to explain to his mother why he had not. She had said, what does she talk about? He had said, the price of things. She had said, which things? He had said, all things. He had said, she has maintained a detailed mental record of the price of every staple item since she began buying them in the 1970s, and she monitors current prices against this record with the specific, rigorous attention of someone conducting a long-term study. She had said, is the study published? He had said, it is delivered to me every Wednesday at 7 in the evening. She had laughed. The specific, unguarded laugh that arrived in the last 4 minutes when the subject had shifted and the weight had briefly lifted and her body remembered that it was capable of this sound. He had said, she would like you. She had said, why? He had said, because you are precise about things that matter and you do not waste what is available. He said, she is the same. He had said, she used to say, a thing unused is a thing wasted. He said, she meant it about food specifically, but I think she meant it about most things. She had said, my mother used to say the same thing about time. She had said, Time not used is time given back to God, and God has enough time already. She had said, she was a specific kind of woman. He had said, was? She had said, she died when Emeka was 2. She had said, she did not meet him enough. She had said, she would have been extraordinary with him. She had said, they had the same quality, the same specific refusal to accept the approximate when the accurate was available. He had looked at her. He had said, she met him 2 years. She had said, yes. He had said, 2 years with someone like that is not nothing. She had said, no. She had said, it is not nothing. The bus had come. She had thought boarding, he does that. He finds the almost in everything. He had found the almost in almost nothing. That was the first morning. He found the 2 years in 2 years is not enough. He looked at what was there rather than what was missing. She had thought, that is a particular and unusual quality in a person. Emeka had opinions about Chudi. This was not a surprise. Emeka had opinions about everything, delivered with the specific, unself-conscious quality of a child who had been raised to say what he thought and had found, in 11 months of treatment, additional confirmation that precision mattered and imprecision cost you. After the 14 minutes in the shop, he had said, on the walk home, he is sad. She had said, who? He had said, Chudi. He had said, not always. Not like yours. He had said, his is older. Like something that has been there a long time and has found its shape. He had said, I think it is from his wife. She had stopped walking. She had looked at her 11-year-old son. He had said, you told me she died. He had said, I could see it. The shape of it. He had said, it is different from the shape of someone who has not lost someone. He had said, it is quieter. He had said, I think your shape is quieter now too than it was in the first months. She had said, Emeka. He had said, I am not saying this badly. He had said, I am saying I can see that something has changed the shape and that the shape is getting quieter. She had said, you notice things. He had said, I have had a lot of time to notice things. He had said, hospital waiting rooms are good for noticing. He had said, you learn to read people when you are 11 years old in a waiting room for 10 months. She had looked at him. She had said, the shape of it is quieter now. He had said, yes. He had said, I think that is good. He had said, quieter is not the same as gone. He had said, but quieter is better than louder. She had said, yes. He had said, he should come to dinner. She had said, Emeka. He had said, I am being practical. He had said, he brings you things every morning. He has never been to the flat. This is imbalanced. He had said, also his soup is probably better than yours. She had said, you have not eaten his soup. He had said, I am extrapolating from the tea. The tea is better than average. She had said, you cannot extrapolate soup quality from tea quality. He had said, I can extrapolate most things. She had said, I know. She had said, it is not always appropriate. He had said, when will it be appropriate? She had said, not today. He had said, when? She had said, soon. He had said, soon is not a date. She had looked at her son. She had said, give me a month. He had said, 1 month. She had said, 1 month. He had said, I will hold you to this. She had said, I know. The dinner happened in the 8th month. Not because of the 1-month promise, because of the 8th month and what the 8th month was, which was the first month that was not entirely defined by the treatment. Not because the treatment was over, it was not over. But the 8th month had a specific incremental quality of being slightly more itself and slightly less the treatment's month than the previous months had been. Emeka had a good week. 2 good weeks. He had gone back to the drawing. He drew seriously, with the specific focus of someone for whom drawing was not decoration but inquiry, the attempt to understand a thing by rendering it accurately. He had been drawing the hospital equipment for months. In the 8th month, he had begun drawing other things. He had drawn Chudi's shop. From memory, from the 14 minutes, the counter, the shelves, the window, the awning. It was accurate in the specific way Emeka's drawings were always accurate. Not photographic but structurally correct, capturing the particular quality of the space rather than simply its dimensions. She had looked at it and she had thought, he has drawn the quality of it. The specific, unhurried quality of a shop that is owned by a person who knows what they are doing and has decided it is enough. She had said, "This is very good." He had said, "Can we give it to him?" She had said, "Yes." She had said, "Come for dinner on Saturday." She had said it to the window in the morning, to the silhouette before he crossed, which was the most nervous way she had said anything in 11 months and which she had chosen deliberately because saying it to the window meant she did not have to watch his face receive it. He had crossed with the tea. He had said, "What time?" She had said, 7. He had said, "I will bring bread." She had said, "You do not have to bring anything." He had said, "I know." He had said, "I will bring bread." He had brought bread. And something from the shop that required no explanation. A small thing, placed on the kitchen counter without ceremony. Emeka had looked at it and looked at Chudi and said, "Correct." She had not asked what correct meant. Emeka's vocabulary of approval was its own system and not always available for translation. The dinner had been ordinary in the specific way that mattered, the way that ordinary means the thing has found its natural form, that it is not performing. They had eaten. Emeka had talked about the research professor's latest email, which contained a reference to a study published 18 months ago that Emeka had already read and had opinions about. Chudi had listened with the full quality of someone who was receiving this information rather than waiting for it to end. He had asked 2 questions. Emeka had answered both at length. He had asked a third. Emeka had said, "That is the right question." He had said, "I know." He had said it without performance, simply accurately. After dinner, Emeka had produced the drawing. He had placed it on the table in front of Chudi without preamble. Chudi had looked at it for a long time. He had said, "This is my shop." Emeka had said, "Yes." He had said, "You drew this from the 14 minutes." Emeka had said, "Yes." He had said, "You have drawn the quality of it, not just the structure." Emeka had said, "That is what drawing is for." Chudi had looked at the drawing for another moment. He had said, "Emeka." He had said, "Thank you." Emeka had said, "You are welcome." He had said, "You can keep it." Chudi had folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. She had watched him do this and she had thought, "He will put it somewhere specific. He will not leave it in the jacket pocket, but he will find a place for it that is considered, and she will not know where the place is unless she asks, and she will not ask unless she is in the flat enough to notice what is on the walls." She had thought, "I want to be in the flat enough to notice." She had thought, "That is a new thought." She had told Adana about the dinner the following Sunday. She had said, "He came for dinner." She had said, "He brought bread." Adana had said, "Bread." She had said, "Yes." Adana had said, "What kind?" She had said, "The good kind. The kind from the shop on the corner that you have to get to by 8 in the morning or it is gone." Adana had said, "He got there by 8 in the morning to get the bread for your dinner." She had said, "Yes." Adana had said, "Ada." She had said, "I know." Adana had said, "Does he know?" She had said, "Know what?" Adana had said, "Ada." She had said, "I know what you are asking." She had said, "I do not know if he knows." Adana had said, "How can he not know?" She had said, "Because I have not said it." Adana had said, "Ada." She had said, "I know." She had put the phone down. She had sat in the flat in the evening and thought about what Adana had said. How can he not know? She had thought about the mandarin orange. I thought you needed something that required attention. She had thought about the soup, about sitting on the wall, about the inventory system in the back room, about bread from the shop on the corner that you have to get to by 8 in the morning. She had thought, he probably knows. She had thought, we are 2 people who pay attention. She had thought, we have both been paying attention. She had thought about Ngozi saying, the knowing does not change the feeling. She had thought, no. She had thought, but the saying of it changes something. She had thought, in the morning I should say it. She had thought this every morning for 3 more weeks before the difficult month arrived and took the space that the thought had been occupying. She had learned that he was not a man who slept easily. Not from him directly, from the specific, small evidence that accumulates when you have been paying attention to someone for long enough. On the mornings after his mother called, he arrived at the window a few minutes later than usual, with the specific, slightly weighted quality of someone whose sleep had been interrupted by the thinking that follows a Wednesday phone call. On the mornings after a difficult stock delivery, the supplier who was unreliable, the one whose inconsistency required him to adjust the week's ordering on short notice. He was at the window at 6:45 rather than 7, the specific earliness of someone who had given up on the remaining sleep and decided to use the time. She had noticed this over months without naming it until Emeka had said, "He has your quality." She had said, "Which quality?" He had said, "The one where you are already somewhere else when you are still here." He had said, "Not in a bad way." He had said, "In the way where the thinking does not stop when the doing stops." He had said, "I have it too." He had said, "The doctors call it something, but I think it is just what it looks like when a person cares about things." She had said, "When did you become this?" He had said, "I have always been this." He had said, "The hospital gave me more time to be it out loud." She had looked at her son and thought, 11 years old and already in possession of himself in a way that some people spend their whole lives approaching. She had thought, "You get credit for some of this." She had thought, "Gerald gets credit for some of this too." There was a morning in the 6th month when he had said something she had returned to many times since. They had been in the last 4 minutes, the lighter part, after the weight had been in the room and was being set down briefly. She had been telling him about a patient at the hospital, a man of 70 who had been in the ward for 3 weeks and who had no visitors, who had said to her on a Thursday, "Nurse, do you think a person can outlive the people who knew them when they were young?" She had said, "What do you mean?" He had said, "I mean that all the people who knew me at my best are gone." He had said, "The people who are left know me at my diminished." He had said, "Sometimes I think dying would be less lonely than this." She had told Chudi this on the Friday morning. He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "What did you say to him?" She had said, "I said, I know you at this and this is not diminished. This is specific." She had said, "I told him that the people who knew him young knew a version that was not yet finished." She had said, "I told him the unfinished version is not the truest version. The truest version is the one that has had time to become what it was going to become." Chudi had been quiet. She had said, "I do not know if it helped." He had said, "It helped." He had said it with a certainty that was not about the patient or not only about the patient. She had looked at him. He had said, "The unfinished version is not the truest version." She had said, "Yes." He had been quiet for another moment. He had said, "Ngozi died before I understood some things." He had said, "I have spent 6 years understanding them after." He had said, "She knew the unfinished version." He had said, "I think she would have liked the version that has had time." She had said, "Yes." She had said it with the specific quality of someone who knows exactly what is being said and means their yes as fully as a yes can be meant. The bus had come. She had gotten on it. She had sat on the bus and thought about the unfinished version and the version that has had time. She had thought about herself at 28 before Emeka, before his father who had left when Emeka was 4, before 14 years of nursing and 11 months of a bus stop. She had thought, that version did not know what this version knows. She had thought, the patient was wrong. The truest version is the one that has had time to become what it was going to become. She had thought, I am still becoming. She had thought, so is he. She had thought, we are both versions that have had time. She had told him about Emeka's father in the 5th month. Not as a central telling, as a peripheral one, the way peripheral things emerge when you have been talking to someone for 5 months in 12-minute increments and the peripheral things are no longer peripheral because they have been accumulating at the edge of every conversation and have built up enough weight to require saying. She had said, Emeka's father left when Emeka was 4. She had said, it was not dramatic. She had said, he was a person who needed more freedom than a family provides and he had stayed for 4 years trying to be what he was not and leaving was the honest thing. She had said, I was angry for 2 years. She had said, then I stopped being angry because the anger was using energy I needed for other things. She had said, Emeka has not asked about him in 3 years. Chudi had said, has he asked at all? She had said, once. He had said, what did he ask? She had said, he asked if his father knew about the condition. She had said, I said yes, I had told him. Emeka had said, what did he say? She had said, he said he hoped Emeka would be all right. Emeka had said, that is something. She had said, yes. He had said, "It is not enough, but it is something." She had said, "Yes." He had not said anything else about it. Trudy had said, "He has your precision." She had said, "What do you mean?" He had said, "He assessed it accurately." He said, "It is not enough, but it is something." He had said, "That is a precise and correct assessment for an 11-year-old to make." She had said, "He had been in a hospital waiting room for 5 months by then." She had said, "Waiting rooms change what you assess as enough." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "What do you assess as enough?" She had looked at him. She had said, "More than I used to." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "Me too." The bus had come. She had gotten on it. She had thought, "More than I used to." She had thought, 12 minutes used to not be enough. She had thought, 12 minutes has become the shape of what is available, and what is available has been enough. She had thought, what would more than the 12 minutes look like? She had thought this for the first time in the 5th month, and had then not thought it again for several months because the thinking had arrived before she was ready for what the thinking required, and she had put it down and walked past it the way you walk past a thing you are not yet ready to pick up. She had picked it up again in the 8th month when he had come for dinner. She had put it down again when the difficult month arrived. She had picked it up for the last time on the morning she arrived at 7 and said, "I do not want the 12 minutes anymore." The bus stop itself had changed over the 11 months. Not physically. The same wall, the same lamp post, the same crack in the pavement she had noted the first morning and which had widened slightly by autumn but no further since. What had changed was what the bus stop was. It had been the gap between leaving and arriving, between being Emika's mother and being a nurse, the place where she was allowed to be neither for 12 minutes. It had been the place where she cried. By the 7th month it was also the place where she laughed. By the 9th month it was the place where she told the truth about things she had not told anyone else. Not because she had no one else, she had Mrs. Bello and Adana and her colleagues, but because the 12-minute constraint produced a specific, clarifying quality of honesty. She could not afford to be imprecise in 12 minutes. She could not afford to approach the thing from the side. The 12 minutes required her to say the central thing because there was no time for anything else. She had said to Trudy once, "I am more honest at this bus stop than anywhere else." He had said, "Why?" She had said, "Because I have 12 minutes." She had said, 12 minutes teaches you which things matter enough to say." He had said, "What things?" She had said, "Emika." She had said, "The research professor." She had said, "Gerald's wheel." She had said, "Your mother's soup." She had said, "The unfinished version and the version that has had time." He had said, "Those are the things that matter." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "What else?" She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "This." He had said, "Yes." He had said it in the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a particular word to arrive and has received it and is not going to make more of the receiving than the word requires. The bus had come. She had gotten on it. She had thought, "I said this." She had thought, "He said yes." She had thought, "That is everything necessary and nothing unnecessary, and we did it in 12 minutes. She had thought, "He was right about one thing on the very first morning." She had said, "There is nothing you can do." He had said, "Almost nothing." She had thought, "The almost has turned out to contain more than I knew." The difficult month arrived in the 9th month. Not announced, the way difficult things arrive in the middle of something that has been going in a direction, when the direction shifts and you find yourself in territory that the previous months had not prepared you for because the previous months had been, if not good, at least moving. Dr. Okafor told her on a Thursday afternoon. He told her accurately the way he had always told her because she was a nurse and she had asked for the accurate version from the beginning and he had given it. He said, "This is not a setback that changes the overall trajectory." He said, "It means an adjustment to the protocol." He said, "Emika will be more tired." He said, "It will be a difficult month." She had driven home. She had told Emika. He had said, "More tired than now?" She had said, "Yes." He had said, "More Gerald?" She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Gerald's wheel is worse." She had said, "I asked them about replacing it." He had said, "Do not replace it. Gerald would not be Gerald with a fixed wheel." She had said, "Emika, I am being serious." He had said, "I am also being serious." He had said it with the specific, settled quality of someone for whom this was not a negotiating position but a considered view. He had said, "Gerald and I have an understanding." She had said, "Gerald is a piece of medical equipment." He had said, "Gerald is Gerald." She had called Adana. She had said, "It is a difficult month." Adana had said, "I am coming." She had said, "Not this month. Let me get through this month." Adana had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Ada, I want to come." She had said, "I know." She had said, "But I need to do this month the way I have done the other months." She had said, "If you come I will spend the month managing your worry instead of managing mine." Adana had been quiet again. She had said, "Call me every day." She had said, "Yes." She had not called Chuti. She had not crossed the street. She had gone to the bus stop the next morning and she had stood there and the crying had arrived in the earlier, rawer form. The form from before the routine had found its shape. The form from before the 12 minutes had become the thing she organized around. He had crossed at 7:18. He had not brought tea. He had said, "How bad?" She had said, "Not the worst kind. The difficult kind." He had said, "All right." He had sat on the wall beside her. Not the counter facing the window, the wall at the bus stop, outside his shop, on the street beside her, and he had not said anything else. The bus had come at 7:23. She had looked at him as she boarded. He had raised one hand. She had put her hand against the glass as the bus pulled away. She had cried on the bus. Not at the bus stop, on the bus, which was the first time in 9 months the crying had not stayed in its place. She had cried on the bus and the woman beside her had looked out the window with the specific, careful quality of someone who has decided not to notice, which was its own kind of kindness. The difficult month was the month everything became clear. Not dramatic and not sudden, the specific, gradual quality of something becoming visible, the way things become visible when the light changes, when what was already there has been illuminated in a way that allows it to be seen fully for the first time. The food arrived on the 5th day. She had come home from the hospital to find Mrs. Bello at her door with a container of soup and a bag of provisions from the shop. She had said, "From Chuti." She had said, "He said the vegetable situation at the shop and he thought." Mrs. Bello had said it exactly the way she imagined he had said it to Mrs. Bello, with the specific, deflecting quality of someone who does not want the kindness examined too closely. She had said, "Mrs. Bello." Mrs. Bello had said, "The soup is already made." She had taken the soup. She had sat at the kitchen table and eaten it and it had been good soup. Not Ngozi's groundnut soup, a different soup, the specific soup of someone who cooks practically and well without making a production of the cooking. She had thought about him on the other side of the street making this soup and giving it to Mrs. Bello with the specific, deflecting language of someone who did not want the kindness to cost her anything by requiring acknowledgement. She had thought, "This is a person who has been paying attention." The next morning she had said, "Thank you for the soup." He had said, "Mrs. Bello said you had been working long shifts." She had said, "It was good soup." He had said, "It is my mother's recipe." He had said, "I use it when I do not want to think about what I am making. It makes itself." She had said, "Chuti." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "I do not know what I would do without the 12 minutes." He had said, "You would manage." He had said it without false modesty, accurately. She would manage. She was a person who managed. He said, "But I am glad you do not have to." She had said, "I am also glad." The bus had come. She had not gotten on it. She had said, "There is another bus in 20 minutes. He had said, "Yes." She had said, "I will be late." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "I am going to be late." She had stayed for the 20 minutes. She had not cried. The food arrived twice more during the difficult month. Each time with the same specific deflection, Mrs. Bello as the courier, the practical explanation about the shop, the clear message that no acknowledgement was required. Each time she had said thank you the next morning and he had received the thank you with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who does not need to be thanked but is not going to deny the person the right to thank them. She had started leaving 15 minutes earlier. Not 3 weeks into the difficult month, from the day after the bus she had stayed for. She told herself it was because the mornings were cold and the shop was warm and the kettle was already on. She told herself this until she stopped telling herself anything about it and accepted that she left 15 minutes earlier because 15 minutes in the warm shop before the bus stop was worth the early rising and was not nothing. He showed her the back room. Not as a gesture, practically, because she had asked about the stock rotation on a morning when she had arrived early and the shop was quiet, and she had found herself curious in the specific, genuine way of someone who has been looking at a place from the outside for long enough that they have developed theories about how it works and want to know if the theories are correct. He had said, "Come and see." The back room was organized with the same specific logic as the shop floor. Not alphabetical, not categorical, the specific logic of what sold with what and what was needed together and when. She had said, "Who taught you this system?" He had said, "I invented it." She had said, "I invented something similar for my medication schedule at the hospital." He had said, "What is your system?" She had told him. He had said, "Yours is better for perishables." She had said, "Yours is better for non-perishables." He had said, "We could combine them." She had said, "We could." They had stood in the back room of the provisions shop discussing inventory management at 7 in the morning during the most difficult month she had experienced in the 11 months of the treatment, and it had been, in the specific way that unexpected things sometimes are, exactly what was needed. She had not known she needed to talk about inventory management. She had needed to be with someone who made ordinary things available when ordinary things were what she required. She had thought of him saying, "I think you needed something that required attention." She had thought, yes. She had thought, "That is what you have been giving me. Something that required attention." The month ended. Not dramatically, with the specific incremental quality of a difficult thing completing itself, the numbers moving back in the direction Dr. Okafor wanted them to move, Emeka's tiredness reducing by degrees until one morning he had appeared in the kitchen and eaten his breakfast with the specific, unhurried quality of a child who is not performing wellness but is simply well. She had watched him eat and she had thought, "There he is. That is the one who named the four-stand Gerald and will not let me replace the wheel." She had driven him to the clinic. Dr. Okafor had reviewed the numbers. He had said, "The adjustment has held." He had said, "We are back on the trajectory." He had said, "The difficult month is over." She had said, "What next?" He had told her, 3 more months of the adjusted protocol. Then a reassessment. Then, with the specific, careful qualification of a doctor who does not promise outcomes, the possibility of a transition to a maintenance phase. She had driven home. She had told Emeka. He had said, "I need to tell Gerald." She had said, "Emeka." He had said, "Gerald has been with me for 10 months. He deserves to know." She had said, "All right." She had said, "Tell Gerald." He had gone to his room and she had stood in the corridor for a moment listening to her 11-year-old son inform a piece of medical equipment that the difficult month was over and the trajectory was correct, and that the wheel was still not going to be replaced. She had put her hand over her mouth. She had laughed. Not the laugh of someone performing relief, the specific, unguarded laugh of someone for whom something has broken through, for whom the body has decided that what has just happened is both absurd and exactly right and requires the physical acknowledgement of laughter. She had laughed in the corridor of her flat with her hand over her mouth and Emeka's voice carrying from his room talking to Gerald and the evening proceeding around her. She had called Adana. She had said, "The difficult month is over." Adana had said, "Ada." She had said, "He is back on the trajectory." She had said, 3 more months, then the reassessment. Adana had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "And Chuti?" She had said, "I am going to tell him in the morning." She had said it without thinking, the specific, unguarded quality of a statement that arrives before the person has decided to make it, that comes from the place below the deciding. Adana had been quiet. She had said, "Ada." She had said, "I know what you said." She said, "I know it has been 12 minutes and tea." She had said, "But I want to say something." She had said, "Ngozi." She had stopped. She had said, "He told you about Ngozi." She said, "Yes." She had said, "A man who will tell you about the person he loved and lost is a man who is not closed." She had said, "I am just noting this." She had said, "Good night, Adana." She had said, "Good night. Call me tomorrow." She had not slept. Not from anxiety, from the specific, wakeful quality of someone who has made a decision in the unguarded moment and is now living with the decision in the hours before it is acted on. She had not overturned the decision. She had not examined it from every angle to find the angle at which it became a mistake. She had simply lain awake with it the way you lie awake with something that is real and that tomorrow you are going to say out loud. She thought about the 11 months. She thought about the first morning, the raw, ungoverned crying, the bus 3 minutes late, the 11 minutes of it. She thought about the morning he had crossed the street. He had said, "I have been watching you cry at this bus stop every morning for 11 months. He had said, "I do not know you and you do not have to tell me anything. But I am asking." She thought, "That is a person crossing the street to say I see you." She thought, "That is not nothing." She thought about the mandarin orange, about the soup that made itself, about sitting on the wall beside her when the bus came and letting the bus go and raising one hand, about the back room and the inventory system and the specific, ordinary conversation that was exactly what the difficult month had needed when dramatic comfort was not what the difficult month required. She thought, "I have been at a bus stop for 11 months and he has been across the street." She thought, "In the morning I am going to tell him that is not where I want him to be anymore." She went to sleep. The morning was a Tuesday. She arrived at the bus stop at 7. Not 7:15, 7, the full 15 minutes early, the specific earliness of someone who has decided they do not want to spend any of the available time on the wrong side of a decision. He was behind the counter at 7. She could see him through the window. He was doing the morning stock check, the clipboard, the systematic movement through the shelves, the specific, unhurried efficiency of someone who has been doing this for 8 years and has the rhythm of it in his body. He looked up at 7:02 and saw her at the bus stop. He was there at 7:03 without the tea. He had come straight from the stock check, clipboard still in hand, the specific, unplanned quality of someone who has seen something and responded before deciding to respond. He said, "You are early." She said, "Yes." He said, "How is Emeka?" She said, "The difficult month is over." She said, "Dr. Okafor says we are back on the trajectory." She said, "He is well." She said, "He told Gerald last night." He said, "How did Gerald receive the news?" She said, "With equanimity." She said, "Gerald is a steady presence." He looked at her. He said, "Ada." She said, "Yes." She said, "I came early because I have something to tell you and I did not want to tell it in 12 minutes. He was quiet. She said, 11 months ago you crossed the street and you said you did not know me and I did not have to tell you anything. She said, "I told you everything." She said, "You have been across the street for 11 months and you have been present in the specific way that I needed someone to be present and I did not know I needed that until you were." She said, "You gave me the 12 minutes. She said, "You gave me the mandarin orange." She said, "You said almost when I said almost nothing and the almost mattered." She said, "You sat on the wall beside me when the bus came and went and you raised one hand and I put my hand on the glass." She said, "Chudi." She said, "I do not want the 12 minutes anymore." He said, "No?" She said, "I want more than the 12 minutes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes." He said, "I know." He said, "I have known since the mandarin orange." He said it in the specific, direct quality that was simply how he said things, plainly, because plainness was what he had and what he was and what he offered. She said, "Why did you not say so?" He said, "Because you were at a bus stop for 11 months and you needed the 12 minutes to be the 12 minutes. He said, "I was not going to make the 12 minutes into something you had to manage on top of everything else you were managing." He said, "I was going to wait until you did not need me to wait anymore." She said, "I do not need you to wait anymore." He said, "I know." He put the clipboard down on the wall. The bus came at 7:23. She did not get on it. The months after were not the end of the story, but they were the end of this telling of it. Emeka's treatment continued, 3 months of the adjusted protocol, the reassessment, the conversation with Dr. Okafor that Ada had been building toward for a year. Dr. Okafor said, "The numbers support a transition to maintenance." He said, "We will monitor closely." He said, "This is good news." She had said, "It is also not the end of it." He had said, "No." He had said, "It is the beginning of the management of it." He had said, "Those are different things." She had said, "I know." She had said, "I am a nurse." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "You are also his mother." He had said, "Those are also different things." She had driven home and told Emeka. He had said, I need to tell Gerald. She had not said Emeka. She had said, go. He had gone to his room and told Gerald that the maintenance phase had begun, and that the trajectory was correct, and that the wheel remained as it was. Chudi had been in the flat when she came out of the corridor. He was at the kitchen table. He had been there for an hour. He had let himself in with the key she had given him in the 10th month, which she had given to him not ceremonially but practically, in the way she did things, saying, you left something here last week and I am not always home when you come to collect it, so here. He had taken the key without making it ceremonial. He had used it correctly, to be present, not to preside. He had said, how did it go? She had said, maintenance phase. She had said, this is good news. He had said, yes. She had said, I need to call Adana. He had said, call her. She had called. Adana had said, Ada. She had said, maintenance phase. Adana had been quiet for a moment. She had said, I am coming. She had said, not now. She had said, Ada. She had said, Adana. She had said, next month. She had said, bring Chudi's mother's soup recipe. Adana had laughed. She had put the phone down. She had looked at Chudi at her kitchen table. She had thought, this is what it looks like. She had thought, a man at your kitchen table after the maintenance phase has begun and your son is in the back room telling Gerald. She had thought, this is the shape the thing has found. There is something this story wants to say before it closes. He saw her crying at the bus stop every morning for 11 months. He had a counter that faced a window and she was there at 7:15 and he was there at 7 and the window faced the stop and he was a person who paid attention. For 11 months he noticed. For 11 months he did not ask. And then on a Tuesday in the 11th month he crossed the street. He said, I have been watching you cry here every morning for 11 months. He said, I do not know you and you do not have to tell me anything. He said, but I am asking. He crossed the street. This is the whole action. This is the thing that the story is about. Not the tea or the mandarin orange or the soup or the hand against the glass or the 15 minutes early on a Tuesday morning. All of those things followed from one person deciding that crossing the street was the available thing and doing it. Because he asked, she told him. Because she told him, he knew. Because he knew he was able to be what she needed. Not everything, not a solution, not the person who took the weight from her because the weight was not transferable. Simply the person across the street who brought something that required attention and sat on the wall when the bus came and went and let the bus go and raised one hand. Because of the hand, she put her hand against the glass. Because of the glass, she knew what she was holding. Because she knew what she was holding, she came early on a Tuesday morning and said, I do not want the 12 minutes anymore. All of it, from one man crossing the street on a morning when crossing the street was what was available and choosing to do the available thing. The closing question is simple. Who are you watching from across the street? Who has been at their bus stop every morning carrying something you have noticed but have not asked about because asking feels like an intrusion, because you do not know them well enough, because the moment has not arrived. The moment arrived 11 months ago. Cross the street.